Good afternoon, and welcome to part 5 of our 6-part presentation on the United States and the Cold War, looking at American foreign policy from 1945 through 1972. And from the presentation last week, we were talking here in terms of the presidential administration of Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, as we know from last time, would be first and foremost, right out of the gate in terms of U.S. foreign policy. He brings about a formal end to the Korean War, which the Americans would certainly consider a success because the objective, remember, was to reestablish, in essence, the 38th parallel, and that was, for the most part, basically done by the time the armistice was signed in July of 1953. By the same end, second of all, Dwight Eisenhower wanted to end Joe McCarthy's career, not so much McCarthy's career, at least not initially, but he wanted here to end McCarthyism. Not one communist had been found. This was bizarre, it was strange, it was no longer needed in any way, shape, or form. And when we saw last time when Joe McCarthy decided, at least indirectly, to take on Dwight Eisenhower by going after the U.S. Army, it sealed his fate. And he's ultimately destroyed. His political career is ruined by December of 1954, just a few months after the Army-McCarthy hearings, when McCarthy proved, in essence, to be his own worst enemy. Well, we saw here from the perspective as well of Dwight Eisenhower becoming all the more concerned over the course of the 1950s of this arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. He had been at the forefront, of course, in World War II as the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in the framework here of Western Europe, in particular the European theater here of World War II. And he saw the horrors that war, in fact, could formally bring. And now you have the ushering in of this new age, the nuclear age, and the United States and the Soviet Union, as we know when he comes to office in 1953, has enough in their respective nuclear stockpiles to blow up every inch of the planet 3 times over, and it's only going to expand over the course of the 1950s. So publicly, this image of Dwight Eisenhower as being this Cold War warrior, very strong in terms of his hostility towards the Soviet Union. Quite frankly, it didn't matter if you were a Republican or a Democrat, you had to toe the party line. What I mean the party line is here in the Cold War, a very get-tough policy against the Soviet Union and against communism in general. But the one thing you did not want to be accused of in any way, shape, or form is being soft on communism. Certainly publicly, Dwight Eisenhower is going to have that approach, but privately, he's very concerned as to where this is going to lead the two nations. Down this road of destruction is what he sees, and we're going to be rebuilding our respective nations, recovering here from mass ashes. Quite frankly, he's correct. So what he becomes all the more focused on, here as he is reelected in 1956, is to perhaps sit down with the Soviets and have some sort of long-term deal that could bring about not an end to the Cold War per se, but more of a thaw in the Cold War. More of a lessening of tension if that was at all possible. Well, he also knows that there's great tension between the two communist superpowers, the Soviet Union and the nation of China, the People's Republic of China. That the two nations not only do not like each other, they despise one another. And it's something that Eisenhower is also thinking may be beneficial for the Americans in the long run to perhaps exploit the differences between these two nations. Well, we concluded with our overview of Vietnam, and we stressed that for many ways Vietnam is comparable to Korea. And that you have here this struggle going on, just like Korea was part of the old Japanese Empire, Imperial Japan prior to World War II. Well, French Indochina was part, of course, of the French Empire, consisting of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in the aftermath of World War II, Ho Chi Minh, who is a nationalist, he is also here a Moscow-trained communist, is leading this uprising against the French. As far as the Vietnamese are concerned, at least followers of Ho Chi Minh, is they want France out of Vietnam once and for all. Enough is enough. They're the most prominent, the most dominant here of these 3 entities in French Indochina, far more strong than Cambodia or Laos, but still light years weak, especially if compared to France. And for Ho Chi Minh, his great hero is, in fact, Thomas Jefferson, or I should say was, in fact, Thomas Jefferson. For Thomas Jefferson argued here that all men are created equal. and stressed by the same token that it was the duty here, if there's injustice going on, to rise above this injustice. And as far as Ho Chi Minh was concerned, as far as he saw it, this great injustice was the French imperialism that had dominated historic Vietnam for decades and was now attempting to continue this domination in the aftermath of World War II. Well, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces are going to ultimately here rise up in open rebellion against French authority in Vietnam in 1945, and this huge struggle begins between the French and between the Vietnamese. It starts in 1945, continues on into the early 1950s. The United States is going to be financing, under the presidency of Harry Truman, about 40% of this war come 1951. And by the time Eisenhower takes office in 1953, the United States is financing 80% of the French war cost. The chief issue here for the U.S. government, and indeed for the American CIA, is the fact that Ho Chi Minh is a communist. And this is a communist movement. Remember the Truman Doctrine. The United States will defend any nation, anywhere in the world, that is opposed to communism. Well, this becomes here a grave concern. Well, for Dwight Eisenhower, he will categorically refuse the French demand in 1954 to send in American bombers at Dien Bien Phu in the northern part of Vietnam to, in essence here, force the Vietnam forces back that have surrounded the French army. Therefore, there's no other options but for France to formally ask for the terms of an armistice, or the terms here of an exit strategy, if it were at all possible. Well, in 1954, therefore, the plan is for France to withdraw. Vietnam is going to be partitioned along the 17th parallel, and it will be made into two states, very, very similar to what we were talking about some lectures before in this series regarding Korea. The parallels are striking. North Vietnam is going to be a communist state. It will be a communist state led here by Ho Chi Minh. And South Vietnam will be a capitalist state, eventually led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, this partition is in fact meant to be temporary, not permanent. And from the framework here of the North Vietnamese, this is absurd, absolutely absurd. And what Ho Chi Minh starts pushing for as early as 1954 in Geneva, Switzerland, is he starts pushing for open elections to be held immediately. Because Ho Chi Minh, the communist, is very, very strongly convinced that if he goes head-to-head against Bao Dai, who was the original ruler of South Vietnam, or Ngo Dinh Diem, the eventual ruler of South Vietnam, he's going to win in a landslide. There's going to be no contest. And Vietnam will be unified under his communist jurisdiction. He's pushing for it. He's looking for it. This is what he's angling for at Geneva. The Soviet Union strongly supports Ho Chi Minh. Mao Zedong and the communists of China strongly support Ho Chi Minh. And the United States refuses to allow for open elections. And the reason why the Eisenhower administration refuses this is due to the fact they know Ho Chi Minh's going to win. That's not possible. It is not possible to have a communist Vietnam, at least not at this stage. Therefore, this partition is going to remain in effect well past 1954. Well, in 1956, there were supposed to be elections held. Supposed to be here elections held in all of Vietnam to decide, do you want a unified Vietnam under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh or under the South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem? But Ngo Dinh Diem demands that these elections that were to be held in 1956 be postponed indefinitely. Well, for the Eisenhower administration here in South Vietnam, what it's going to start doing is it's going to start pouring a great deal of economic aid into South Vietnam. Just like the U.S. government had been and would continue pouring a great deal of economic aid into South Korea. Just like the United States had been since 1945 and would continue to pour a great deal of economic aid into Japan. To make these nations here stronger. Remember, in this titanic struggle between the United States and Soviet Union, the Soviets can compete with the United States militarily. Economically, oh God, not even close. The Soviet Union's a backward nation about 100 years behind the times. This was true in 1945, it is true in 1955, it is true as Russia in the present day. Totally backwards, totally behind the time. And so what you have here is U.S. foreign policy. The Americans realize they can give, by just giving a great deal of economic aid, kind of like a carrot and stick sort of approach, you can impact here much of foreign policy. You can get these nations, so to speak, on your side. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it at all. It's easier than having to get yourself engaged in an armed struggle. So this is what the U.S. is in fact going to do here. And No Zin Ziem becomes this new ruler of South Vietnam in the 1950s. He categorically refuses in South Vietnam any open elections to be held. And instead he asks the United States for more and more economic assistance. It's going to take him more and more time. Here's the problem. The problem for American foreign policy in the Cold War is due to this inherent hostility that you have for left-wing extremism, communism, Marxism, call it what you will. By the same end, you then end up supporting the extreme right wing, which can be just as bad, just as dangerous, as evidenced by World War II and Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany, a movement of the extreme right wing. Right-wing movements tend to be far more, in terms of militaristic, expansive, from a military standpoint. I would say, for example, Putin in the present day in Russia, he's more of a right-wing autocrat, through and through, an iron-fisted ruler. Though he accuses here the Ukrainian hierarchy of, in fact, being Nazis. It's absurd. It's like, who's the Nazi? Well, you have a situation there that No Zin Ziem is going to be this right-wing, iron-fisted autocrat. And he will rule here South Vietnam with an iron fist, along with his brother, who is also just as corrupt as he is. His name is No Zin Nu. Well, it's a difficult situation, putting it mildly. Here's a photograph of Dwight Eisenhower shaking hands with No Zin Ziem. This photograph is taken in 1957. In between them is the U.S. U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who we had talked about in earlier presentations. But from the Eisenhower perspective, the attitude here is one of, we're going to increase economic aid to South Vietnam. It helped in Japan, here in Asia. It helped in South Korea, here in Asia. It's helped elsewhere, not just in Asia, but throughout Europe and the world. It's also going to help in South Vietnam. And that we are going to, in essence, hope for the best. We have to make a stand here. It is utterly and absolutely imperative to make a stand. Well, one thing Eisenhower is dead set against is sending any American forces to South Vietnam. Not going to happen. Absolutely, positively out of the question. Not going to happen. And the reason is that Eisenhower realizes on the ground in South Vietnam, it's a totally, totally different situation. One of his top advisors was Matthew Ridgway, who he had introduced earlier in the 1950s here. He is going to take full control of the U.S. and UN forces following the firing of Douglas MacArthur in April of 1951. And comparisons were drawn consistently, especially throughout editorials across America in terms of different newspapers, etc. Talking about the commonalities, the similarities of the Korean Peninsula along here now with this partition in Vietnam along the 17th parallel. Matthew Ridgway stressed time and time again here in cabinet meetings in the Eisenhower administration that Vietnam was completely different than Korea. And that South Koreans welcomed here the Americans as their liberators. If we send ground forces at any time in the future, Matthew Ridgway argued here in the 1950s, the Vietnamese are going to see us as nothing more than an extension of French imperialism. Plain and simple. There's nothing to do with communism. If the French tried to hold on to Vietnam, and now the Americans are stepping in, they're bigger, they're far more prominent, far more powerful, they're going to replace French imperialism. By the same end, Ridgway stressed his concern also was with these North Vietnamese communists and South Vietnamese communists working together. What was called collectively as the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. And what the National Liberation Front was doing is you had communists in North Vietnam, it's a communist state. You have communists here working underground in South Vietnam. They're known as the NLF, they're also known as the VC or the Viet Cong. And what they're doing, the South Vietnamese communists, is they're dressed in civilian clothing and they're going to be hitting government installations. You hit, you run. You hit, you run. You hit, you run. Creating as much chaos as humanly possible. Well, Ridgway would stress, and Eisenhower would agree, that if we send American forces into this, it's going to be very, very difficult throughout South Vietnam for the South Vietnamese to figure out who is on their side, in essence here, who's out there, which I should say for the Americans to figure out who is in fact sympathetic to them and who is in fact a closet South Vietnamese communist. You didn't have this problem in South Korea. You've got this problem here in South Vietnam. Finally, Ridgway stressed, point 3, that if the United States were ever to consider sending in ground forces to South Vietnam, it would mean imposing a draft, and you would have to have at least 500,000 American soldiers, minimum, in the jungles of Southeast Asia. More likely, it's going to take 1 million soldiers. To fight a war, according to Ridgway, where there will be open hostility from much, if not most, of the civilian population. Dwight Eisenhower agreed with Matthew Ridgway here in the 1950s 100%. Eisenhower also stressed we need to get rid of this idea that we can do things the cheap and easy way. The cheap and easy way. There is no way whatsoever Dwight Eisenhower would have sent in ground forces to Vietnam. His concern here is with the ineptness of No Sin Sien, how incredibly corrupt he is. He's this right-wing demagogue, this iron-fisted ruler who is alienating much of the South Vietnamese population. Remember, he is Vietnamese, but he has spent the better part of his life in the United States in Baltimore, Maryland, educated at the Marinell Seminary. He's a devout Catholic that's overseeing a Buddhist nation. He's viewed by most South Vietnamese, and certainly virtually all North Vietnamese, as nothing more than an American puppet. And the more he cracks down on the South Vietnamese population, the more dire the situation becomes. The Central Intelligence Agency here is keeping a close eye on matters. And as the 1950s come to an end, they start sending word back to Dwight Eisenhower in the Oval Office of the White House that they're very, very concerned about this guy. That the longer he stays in power in South Vietnam, the less likely it is for South Vietnam to remain independent. The United States really needs to consider about getting rid of him, overthrowing him. This was more or less the CIA commentaries by the year 1960. But what all of it would mean was not entirely sure. But for Dwight Eisenhower, the United States is going to experience more challenges as the 1950s move on. More challenges here as the 1950s move on coming from the Soviet Union. And for the U.S., in 1957, the Soviet Union, to the shock, quite frankly, of the entire world, would launch the first satellite in all of world history, the Sputnik. Now, Sputnik was about the size of a large beach ball, quite frankly. A couple of antennas coming out, and it would orbit around the Earth, and it would make this tremendous sound. Beep, beep, beep. It's really something. Really something in terms of the late 1950s. Well, for Eisenhower and for his administration in 1957, there was a great deal of pressure. How can the Soviets do this? Remember, you have this inherent fear that's already impacted virtually the entire civilization of the United States from the perspective of this fear of communism. And now, suddenly, the Soviet Union, as we lost China, the Soviets have nuclear weapons. Now the Soviets are heading to outer space, and we're not even close. What you have here is a sense that we're falling behind the Soviet Union. Far from it. The Soviets are made out to be this big, great, awesome, monumental force. But the only thing it has is nuclear weapons. Otherwise, it's a no contest, as it's competing against the United States. Well, Eisenhower, his focus is not on outer space. He could care less. His focus, rather, is in terms of building, continuing to strengthen the U.S. nuclear arsenal, because he knows the Soviets are building up their stockpile, even though privately he would like to see some sort of a arms reduction in this Cold War. But if they're going to increase, we have to increase. It's that simple. And what the Americans do just 3 months after Sputnik was launched is they have a rocket of their own, a satellite of their own, Vanguard, 1957. Well, when Vanguard, it was kind of like a rush to get this off the ground, so to speak. And when Vanguard is going to take off, what happens on this rocket is it's launching a satellite into outer space. The rocket goes literally 3 feet off the ground, collapses into a mass ball of flames. Newspapers referred to it as flopnik or stay putnik. And it was incredibly embarrassing for the United States. But the focus for Eisenhower was more on these ICBM missiles. And he also knew that the United States, in terms of missile superiority, that they were light years ahead of the Soviet Union. Eventually, it'll be a few months after that, the Americans will launch their first satellites successfully as well. Leads, in essence, to the race to the moon, really starting with the administration after Dwight Eisenhower's administration. So it's more of a case here in the Cold War as well, in terms of one-upmanship, if you want to refer to it as such. Eisenhower knows, as there's this fear going across the American population, again, as 1957 passes onwards into 1958, that we are falling behind the Soviet Union in this arms race. They're light years ahead of us. He knows that is not true. And in fact, he knows that the United States has, in essence, a 3-to-1 superiority in terms of missiles. How does he know this? It's simple. He knows this, quite frankly, because Americans have these U-2 planes that can fly super high, super fast, 70,000 feet in the air. They aren't really detected by radar. They're difficult to detect by radar. And I could go out, for example, right here at Trinity Woods and hold a needle in the parking lot. And that airplane, 70,000 feet in the air, could take a picture, a photograph of the very peak, very top of this needle. That's how accurate it is. And they're flown by CIA agents. The CIA comes into existence in 1947. What does it set up to do? It's set up to spy on other nations. That's what it does. It's the equivalent of the Soviet KGB. All nations spy on each other, as we stated before. The bottom line is don't get caught. Well, he knows straight out, because of these U-2 flights over the Soviet Union, over Soviet airspace, he knows exactly where all the Soviet missiles are. And he also knows that they're not even close to the technology. They're not even close to the same level here as the U.S. He cannot state that publicly. Because if he states it publicly, he's going to be asked, well, how do you know? And his response would be, well, I just know. Well, how do you know? Well, I know because we're spying on the Soviet Union with our U-2 planes and CIA agents. That's why. Can't say that. That's what the Soviets do. That's what the KGB does. We're still above spying. So Eisenhower, in essence, is caught. His hands are somewhat tied here. But he knows for a fact, because of these U-2 missions, the Soviets lag in missile defense. And the United States is in a vastly superior situation. Well, as the second term continues, he still hasn't given up. There's a U-2 plane right there and a U-2 pilot. He still has not given up on arms reductions with the Soviets. And what he will do, what he is going to do here is he is going to start reaching out to the new General Secretary of the Soviet Union. He's famous for that secret speech, Nikita Khrushchev. And what the Soviets and the Americans are learning is that they've been testing here their respective nuclear weapons over the course of the 1950s. is that the long-term implications is very, very bad for the environment, very dangerous. The radioactive fallouts leading to increased cases of cancer, etc. It's a very, very grave situation across the board. It's not helping the Soviets, it's not helping the Americans either. Therefore, Nikita Khrushchev and Dwight Eisenhower are able to work together. They're able here to work together in 1958 and to come up with a ban on atmospheric testing. It's not a ban on the construction of nuclear weapons or your respective nuclear stockpiles, but it's a ban here on atmospheric testing. A freeze. No longer can you test your respective weapons in the atmosphere. The Soviets agreed to it, the Americans agreed to it. Dwight Eisenhower also invites Nikita Khrushchev to visit the United States. Khrushchev agrees in 1959. And he is in New York City. He is going to be going to Disneyland in California, going to a grocery store in San Francisco, really taking in all the sights. Goes to the Iowa State Fair. They had a beer belly contest, and Nikita Khrushchev joined in on it. He didn't win, but he did pretty well. And it was a sense here for Khrushchev of putting a kinder, gentler face on the Soviet Union, a more human face. It was quite the publicity that he received here over his time of 12 days in the U.S. Very, very wise move indeed. And it did help matters. It did help matters somewhat in terms of smoothing over some tension between these two nations. Well, what Khrushchev and Eisenhower are both interested in is a reduction in this, an end, or I should say a thaw in the Cold War. A reduction, at least in terms of the amount of missiles that they're putting out, that they're building year after year. Dwight Eisenhower knows, even though the 1950s have been the most prosperous decade of all in American history up to that time, he knows that the United States cannot continue on this path. It's not good for the domestic economy. And if the U.S. is having a hard time, the Soviet Union certainly is having a much, much harder time. Remember all the lives lost in World War II for the historic nation of Russia, or the centerpiece of the Soviet Union being Russia. By the same time, when you get to the aftermath of this, you had $464 billion worth of damage. The Soviets aren't even close to rebuilding from World War II. He knows this. So it's something that he believes, Dwight Eisenhower, will appeal to Nikita Khrushchev. He also knows here that it will appeal, that it's also going to appeal to the U.S. government itself. It's a win-win situation. So as 1960 begins, Eisenhower reaches out and he asks for a joint conference that will feature here. It will feature all sorts of nuclear powers, namely the United States, Britain, who now also has a nuclear bomb, France, who has one as well, and the Soviet Union. To talk here in terms of arms reductions across the board. They belong, these four nations, to this very elite club, and they want to be sure that there's no mistakes made, and perhaps a way of lessening tensions is let's start reducing our respective stockpiles. Well, this is going to take place here in Paris in May of 1960. As far as Dwight David Eisenhower, the pride of Abilene, Kansas, is concerned, this is going to be his hallmark. This is going to be here his final step in terms of doing something very, very good. He had a successful 2 terms as president. He knows here in November it's coming to an end. He's got 6 months left. This is his greatest hope of all. Well, the Americans, the Soviets, the British, and the French get together in May of 1960. And as the Paris summit is formally starting off, an incident occurs which is really going to shake the apple cart, so to speak. What is referred to in essence as the U-2 incident. Now, let me give you some background. So I already referenced the fact that the Americans are spying on the Soviets with the CIA. The Soviets are spying on the Americans with the KGB. Double agents, spy versus spy, so on and so forth. Well, the U-2 plane, the Soviets know what's going on. And the Soviets know all about the U-2 plane. The problem, the frustration, is they haven't been able to shoot one down. And what happens here, in May of 1960, just as the Paris summit is getting off the ground, there are reports that a U-2 plane, an American U-2 plane, was shot down over Soviet airspace. The Soviets bring this up. And what Nikita Khrushchev does is he approaches President Eisenhower on the second day of the conference here in May of 1960. He said, President Eisenhower, I'm very concerned. I have just learned earlier this morning that we shot down one of your U-2 planes spying on our nation. What do you have to say for that? Eisenhower already knew a U-2 plane had been shot down, but here's the situation. If you're shot down as a U-2 pilot, most likely you're not going to survive the crash. But if you survive the crash, you carry with you a cyanide capsule that you're expected to, in essence, take one for the team. And you're going to bite into the cyanide capsule and die instantly. So you wouldn't give away any secrets. It's basically, we've got here a corpse. So Eisenhower is already aware of this when he's approached by Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev said, President Eisenhower, I'm very upset, I'm very concerned. We shot down a U-2 plane over Soviet airspace. Eisenhower responded, I'm aware of that. And I want you to know, General Secretary Khrushchev, I want you to know that was not a U-2 plane. That was a weather reconnaissance plane. Weather reconnaissance plane that was tracking the weather over Turkey and got blown off course over the Soviet Union. Khrushchev said, oh, is that correct? Eisenhower said, yes, indeed. Well, later that same day, Nikita Khrushchev approaches Dwight Eisenhower again, and he said, President Eisenhower, I don't think you're being honest with me. Because we can tell from the wreckage it's not a weather reconnaissance plane. We know for a fact it is a U-2 plane, and you are spying on us. Eisenhower's response was, well, General Secretary Khrushchev, what you have to understand is sometimes we use U-2 planes to track the weather. That was a meteorologist flying that plane, okay? It wasn't any sort of CIA agent, if that's what you're hinting at. Khrushchev said, oh, is that correct? Eisenhower said, yes, indeed. The next morning, Nikita Khrushchev approaches Dwight Eisenhower yet again. He said, President Eisenhower, you're not telling me the truth. You're not telling me the truth. I'm convinced here that U-2 plane was being flown by a CIA agent. To which Eisenhower responded, if only that meteorologist were alive, he would tell you straight out, listen, I am a weatherman. I am not working for the CIA. Khrushchev said, oh, is that right? Eisenhower said, yes, indeed. Khrushchev responded, well, actually, your so-called weatherman is Francis Gary Powers, and he has told us he's working for the CIA. To which Eisenhower responded, oh. In other words, he got caught. Khrushchev set the trap, Eisenhower walked right in. And the significance here of this U-2 incident, the significance here is that what happens is it destroys the Paris summit. The Soviet delegation, they packed their bags, led by Nikita Khrushchev, they head back to the Kremlin in Moscow. And Dwight Eisenhower's hope here, his hope of having some significant arms reductions in this war, in this Cold War, are completely and utterly dashed. Well, his last great concern here as his second term as President of the United States winds down will be Cuba. And Cuba, of course, is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Historically, the United States has always had this love affair with Cuba. What I mean by that specifically is eyeing it up because it would have made one awesome state. Right? Sugar plantations, I mean, it was just awesome, just tremendous in terms of economic possibilities. This goes all the way back into the mid-19th century for the U.S. government. Obviously, it doesn't happen. And in the 1950s, Cuba is led by this right-wing autocrat, a gentleman by the name of Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista. And on the 1st of January, 1959, Fulgencio Batista is going to be overthrown in this uprising by Fidel Castro and his many supporters. Now, when this happens in 1959, again, it's a classic example. The U.S. government supported Batista. They knew he was corrupt. They knew there were all sorts of human rights abuses in Cuba, no doubt about it. And so when he's overthrown, the question isn't so much that there was a great deal of surprise in the U.S. State Department in 1959, Rather, it was a question of what is this new guy going to be like, Fidel Castro? And what the US government did is they invited Fidel Castro to come to the United States. Now, Fidel Castro, ironically enough, had been to the US before. He was a superb baseball player and was actually in the minor leagues in the Minnesota Twins organization. An excellent pitcher here in the 1950s. The problem is he had problems with his curveball, which was pretty much his master pitch. And so when he couldn't get that sorted out, that was the end of his baseball career, and he went back and he overthrew Fulgencio Batista. Became a revolutionary instead. But when he comes to the United States, on the course of this 11-day tour, Castro, he would meet with Richard Nixon, the vice president, for over 3 hours. And Nixon would talk with him extensively, and Nixon came away with the impression that from a political perspective, he was fairly moderate. Fairly moderate. However, once Castro goes back to Cuba, he introduced first and foremost major land reform for the Cubans, and he second of all forbade property ownership in Cuba by any foreigners. And third, and most significant of all, he signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union. Oh, wow. Eisenhower was very angry. He wasn't angry with the Soviets when this trade deal was announced. He wasn't angry with the Soviets when this trade deal was announced in early 1960. Rather, he was angry with Castro. And from the standpoint here of the United States, they're closely monitoring matters with Castro. Closely monitoring matters, and the relationship here, which was never really all that warm to begin with, in 1959 between Fidel Castro and the US government, it cooled significantly. And from Castro's standpoint, he was not going to have Cuba become yet another satellite of US imperialism. I mean, in fairness, the United States plays a major role in terms of influencing the politics of Central America as well as South America. And as far as Castro was concerned, he wasn't going to fall into the same sort of scenarios or situations. Well, the United States, of course, going all the way back to the Spanish-American War in 1898, had here a base at Guantanamo Bay. So they did have a foot, so to speak, here in Cuba. And the Eisenhower administration is very concerned. It's very, very concerned in terms of this relationship that's developing and seems to be becoming all the more cozy following the Paris summit. And it's falling apart in 1960. The American CIA was convinced that Castro had to go. Castro here had to go by the early fall of 1960. And what the CIA was doing is it was considering here ways of sweeping Fidel Castro out of power. What the CIA was heavily involved in, beginning in Iran in 1953, and then in 1954 in Guatemala, was in essence influencing people who would be difficult for the US government or US business interests, sweeping them aside and putting somebody more in power who would be easier to work with. In Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh was in power. He was overthrown with the help of the CIA, and the Shah of Iran was put into power in 1953. In 1954 in Guatemala, it was Jacobo Arbenz. And now you have a situation that Fidel Castro is on the CIA list. You want to overthrow him, you want to find a more moderate voice here in Cuba, if at all possible. Well, it's not going to happen during the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower. The plan is slowly being put into works, but it's going to be handed down or handed onwards to whoever the successor would be. Well, in 1960, you have the year of another presidential election, and you have, in essence, two candidates who are strikingly similar. Strikingly similar. The first who will be running on the Republican ticket will be Richard M. Nixon. Nixon was this hardline, anti-Soviet Cold War warrior, through and through. The only person in the entire Republican Party that was more of an anti-Soviet Cold War warrior was Joe McCarthy, plain and simple. Nixon was this fast riser here, first in the House of Representatives as from the state of California, then in the U.S. Senate, and then he becomes in 1952 Eisenhower's vice president. And Eisenhower and Nixon never really had a close relationship to speak of, not in any way, shape, or form. Eisenhower stated about Nixon on a number of occasions, the thing about Dick is that he didn't seem to have any friends. Well, in 1960, Richard Nixon is going to secure the Republican nomination for the White House. And he has more or less changed with the times. In fact, you could best describe him in 1960 as this liberal Republican. Pretty liberal guy, especially for a Republican who tend to be very, very conservative. Well, as he's on the campaign trail in 1960, Dwight Eisenhower, who really didn't like Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower was asked, President Eisenhower, can you tell us 3 major foreign policy decisions that Richard Nixon had input on that you thought was really impressive, was very, very good? Dwight Eisenhower's response was, because they're looking for 3, remember, Dwight Eisenhower's response was, if you give me a couple of weeks, I might think of 1. Wow. Nixon was livid. Thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for all my years of service to you, Ike. Thank you. Well, he most likely is going to be taking on the youngest presidential candidate in all of U.S. history, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. John Kennedy. John Kennedy, by comparison, is no way, shape, or form a liberal Democrat. You could almost say he's more of a conservative Democrat, but I'd say maybe more moderate to conservative. If you compare the domestic policies of Richard Nixon and John Kennedy in 1960, they're virtually identical. If you compare the foreign policies here in the Cold War, Richard Nixon and John Kennedy, they're virtually identical. They're these button-down types. Products here of their respective political parties, but unbelievably similar in terms of their overall outlook. Well, for John Kennedy, he is going to have to struggle here in a very crowded field in 1960. He had been a senator, he'd been a member of the House of Representatives since 1946, same year Nixon came to the House of Representatives. They were both World War II veterans. John Kennedy is going to ascend to the Senate, same year that Richard Nixon does. He is also going to be the senator over the course of the 1950s from the state of Massachusetts. And the front runner, so to speak, in terms of the Democratic primary would be Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota and Wayne Morse from Oregon. And for John Kennedy, the biggest issue that he is facing is his religion. The United States is a Protestant nation for Protestant people. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, plain and simple. Catholics were viewed as total and second class. Most Protestants would see Catholics in the 1950s and early 1960s as these brainwashed papists, belonging here to this weird cult. And I'm saying this as an Irish American and also a Roman Catholic. I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about the whole thing, quite frankly. Because there's blatant bigotry, blatant anti-Catholicism, plain and simple. Well, William F. Buckley, a conservative author, who is also a Roman Catholic, stated that, and I quote, anti-Catholicism in the United States is the anti-Semitism of the intellectuals. As 1960 began, Catholic Americans lived first and foremost overwhelmingly in industrial cities. Second of all, they ate fish on Friday and attended Mass every Sunday. Third, they shunned birth control and boasted very large families. I'm the youngest of 6 kids. My wife is the 8th of 9 kids. She's from Madison, Wisconsin. And I met her on a blind date. And I knew that my mom would be asking me, who is a very devout Catholic, Kimmy, is she Catholic? Is she a Catholic? So you just can't come out on a blind date and say, hi, I'm Tim Crain. Are you a Roman Catholic? My mother's going to want to know. What are you, a total mama's boy? So you can't do that. So what I said instead is, "Oh, does he have any brothers or sisters?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "How many?" She said, "I'm the 8th of 9. I was like, okay, I knew right then she was either Catholic or Mormon. So some of my Jewish friends would say she could have been an Orthodox Jew as well, to which I'd respond, if she was an Orthodox Jew, she wouldn't be going on a date with me. Anyway, you have this, especially in my generation, our like large families. I have 61 first cousins. She had 65 first cousins. Very, very common across Catholic America. And fourth and final for Catholic Americans in 1960, they sent their children to schools run by priests and nuns. Overwhelmingly, Catholics attended Catholic schools. Catholics also became far more prominent with the introduction of that GI Bill, as I had referenced in our presentation earlier this year. It revolutionized here American society, blowing the doors off of higher education, as the federal government's going to be subsidizing college education for countless hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of Americans. Well, the problem here for John Kennedy is that it's going to be an uphill struggle. Time magazine in 1960 stressed the following. Number one, 25% of Americans in 1960 would not vote for a candidate who was Catholic. Number two, 50% of those polled in 1960, early 1960, did not know that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a Catholic. He knew this was going to be rough. He knew it was going to be a huge challenge. But his father, John Kennedy, is the grandson here, I should say great-grandson of Irish immigrants. They're famine Irish, quite frankly. Very, very poor. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was very wealthy in Boston. Always had a chip on his shoulder as well, because Boston was a big Protestant city. And he was never accepted into Boston Brahmin society because he was a Roman Catholic. Therefore, he moved his family of 8 kids to New York City. But Joe Kennedy, because of all these slights, etc., was convinced that one of his boys was going to become president of the United States. And Joe Kennedy also stressed that you win a presidential election, or any election for that matter, with 3 things: money, money, and money. Wow. The first great test for John Kennedy regarding this Catholic issue would be Wisconsin. Wisconsin's mostly a Protestant state. If he could win in Wisconsin, which is also Hubert Humphrey's backyard, of course, from Minnesota, he could, in fact, have a chance at securing this Democratic nomination. Well, he won. Wisconsin was huge, absolutely huge in 1960. Then he went on to West Virginia, which was also an absolute must-win. West Virginia is an overwhelmingly conservative state, very staunchly Protestant, very staunchly anti-Catholic. In fact, probably one of the most anti-Catholic states in the entire northern part of the United States. He won again. Archibald McClish, following John Kennedy's victory in West Virginia here in the Democratic primary, one of the best-known writers and intellectuals, stressed the following. Number one, Catholics do not properly understand the American notions of liberty or freedom. Number two, Catholic schools perpetuated a historical ignorance and moral obtuseness that kept students from sharing the American dream or American ideals. There's a situation here that John Kennedy was going to face this throughout his campaign. In September of 1960, in this deadlock race with Richard Nixon, he would go to the Southern Baptist Convention. It was known to be very, very hostile towards Catholics. And there's a situation that even leading up to this, Dr. Ramsey Pollard, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, stated publicly the following: "I am not going to stand by and keep my mouth shut when a man clearly under the control of the Roman Catholic Church runs for the presidency of the United States." John Kennedy, before this Baptist convention, his political advisors didn't want him to go, stressed that he would not be calling the Pope in terms of any foreign policy decisions. I mean, if you listen to his comments, and he has to do it, it's so insulting for Catholics. It's not all that long ago, 1960. to listen to just the sheer bigotry, the stupidity, the intolerance, the discrimination, the otherness, so to speak. That God knows this Catholic is going to rock the boat. And our white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, which after all we're a nation of immigrants, is going to be forever altered. Well, John Kennedy stresses here before this Baptist convention that it's no more proper for a pope to tell a president how to conduct himself in foreign policy than it is for a Protestant minister to tell his congregation how to vote. It's going to come right down to the wire here in 1960, a toss-up through and through. A toss-up here through and through between Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, and John Kennedy, who certainly isn't of immigrant class America, not by any stretch of the imagination. What's going to play a major role here will be the televised debates. And for the first debate, Richard Nixon had injured his knee, is walking with a limp, and they came on and they wanted to put makeup on him. He said, "You're not putting makeup on me." Absolutely not. And under the hot cameras that evening, the hot lights, etc., he was perspiring continually on black and white television sets across the United States. John Kennedy, by comparison, he could not speak. You can see him with his hands above. Usually his hands would be below the podium because they trembled so much when he was delivering a speech, etc. He could never stop it. But John Kennedy is going to have a great deal of makeup on. He's going to look very fit, very tan. And for Americans who watched the first televised debate, they believed overwhelmingly John Kennedy won. For those who listened to it on the radio, they thought Richard Nixon won. Image plays here a very, very big role. But you have the showdown between this moderate Democrat and this liberal Republican. John Kennedy's focus in the campaign was on a missile gap, saying that we are behind the Soviet Union in terms of missile production, which was not true. And in fairness, he knew it wasn't true. But it was keeping in with what Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 ran on against a bomber gap that we had with the Soviet Union. That wasn't true. And he knew it wasn't true. Ronald Reagan in 1980 ran on the window of vulnerability with the Soviet Union. Well, that wasn't really true either. The U.S. always had a very significant lead in this arms race. No doubt about it. Both our Cold War warriors, it's going to come down to a toss-up. And in November of 1960, John Kennedy in the popular vote would win this razor-thin victory. But once he carries the state of California, it's pretty much over. And it goes well into the early next morning. And you have the youngest president and the first Roman Catholic president ever in all of U.S. history. I would also say that he was in the poorest health of any U.S. president to take the oath of office. He almost died 2 times in the 1950s in back surgery. He has to wear this back brace. As you can see, anytime you see him, even this picture, you can't see it, but usually he's standing like this. He can barely bend over, and he's only 43 years of age. Very, very poor health. He almost died of scarlet fever as a boy. Was given last rites in his life a total of 7 times. And even when he became president of the United States, he was convinced he was not going to live long. He believed this going all the way back very early on in his life, and his 2 closest companions in his family was his brother Joe, who died in the European theater in World War II, and his sister Kathleen, more commonly known as Kip, who was killed in a plane crash in 1946. Following her death, his brother had died in 44, she died in 46. He was convinced he wasn't going to live very long. Well, here, he will take over as the new president of the United States. And what this does for Catholics is it has them entering mainstream. And it's absolutely imperative. This is the reason here, because I feel I've been before a Catholic audience, this kind of hunch I have today. But it's something that as Catholics, what's absolutely imperative is to be the voice of the other. Because our ancestors were discriminated against to the extreme simply because we were Catholic. It's imperative to be the voice for the other. Because why? Simple. Because now Catholics have completely and utterly assimilated. Really, the final stage is John Kennedy's election, at least symbolically, in 1960. Anti-Catholicism begins a steady decline after that. Well, despite the fact that we see the 1960s as this polarizing decade, it is also here this decade of tremendous progress and to some level excess. To give an example here, the economic growth in the nation is stunning. Per capita income is going to reach an all-time high in the 1960s, the most prosperous decade in all of U.S. history. Prices are going to remain stable. Unemployment will remain throughout the better part of the decade, rock bottom. Poverty. And think about poverty in this capitalist nation. Home to the wealthiest nation by far in the history of the world, is certainly in the modern era. And you have, in 1960, 22% of the American population living below the poverty level. Oh my God. How could this happen? How could this be? It's not right. It doesn't make sense, plain and simple. Well, what you have is this transition in terms of economic growth. Poverty is going to decline from 22% in the United States, 22% of Americans, to 12% by the end of the 1960s. But when we think about the 1960s, we certainly don't think about in terms of, the good times. There's a tremendous amount of polarization in the nation. The Vietnam War, the assassination of John Kennedy, of Martin Luther King Jr., of Bobby Kennedy as well. You have here the anti-war protests. You have as well all sorts of chaos. The Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement, really reaching its apex here during the Kennedy administration in the 1960s. You have these grand expectations on the part of the greatest generation's children, more commonly known as baby boomers, because the baby boomers, as far as they know all the good times. The good times, the good times, the good times. They didn't know the Depression. They didn't know World War II. So if things are good, they're just going to keep getting better and better. It's going to be difficult in terms of bridging this with some very unrealistic expectations. Kennedy would take office as this moderate, very popular with the media as well as Americans. And like most presidents, you have very little say, very little control in terms of domestic policy. Vast majority of U.S. presidents, the focus where they're going to have an impact will be in foreign policy, not domestic policy. Domestic policy, that's for Congress. That's pretty much Congress's turf exclusively. Foreign policy, different story. This is good because he's not really interested in domestic policy. And he would support a fair amount of liberal legislation, nevertheless. But when he becomes president, here the focal point is he has, in essence, he's witnessing here, in essence, these unresolved issues. And these unresolved issues are with Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Vietnam. Time and time again, you are going to be picking up, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it makes no difference. You're going to be picking up here what was left over in terms of foreign policy from the previous administration. Such would be the case with John Kennedy. And his first major issue, or his first major concern, will be Cuba. Cuba. Now, Fulgencio Batista is overthrown, as we referenced earlier. Fidel Castro comes to power. And Fidel Castro is going to, for all intents and purposes, make Cuba more of a Soviet satellite state. The chief threat here is political. It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida, right off of Key West. 90 miles from Key West to Havana. So in this situation here, what you have is this communist state. It's the only communist state in all of Central America or South America, or in the North American region for that matter. And for the United States, the world's predominant superpower, this is unacceptable. Well, you have Allen Dulles, who is John Foster Dulles' brother. He's the head of the CIA, and he had been since 1953. Allen Dulles has this plan to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. Now, oftentimes here, there's a saying that when you have, in terms of plans on paper, it can look really great, really awesome. But when you actually put it into operation, it's something completely different. There's this danger of groupthink coming to the surface. Groupthink is basic, it's a political science term. Everybody's sitting around the table like, this is how it's going to happen. A, B, C, D, E. And what Allen Dulles is portraying this to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and John Kennedy's administration, is that what we're going to do is we're going to take these anti-Castro Cuban exiles who reside overwhelmingly in Miami, they lost their large estates, etc., they're mad as hell. We're going to arm them, we're going to train them, and we're going to land them. We are going to land them here in Cuba, on the southern part of the island, along this area of the Bay of Pigs. Right here is the Bay of Pigs. And the CIA is going to support this operation. And once we get these anti-Castro Cuban exiles, about 1,500 of them, once we get them ashore, there's going to be this spontaneous uprising across all of Cuba, and Fidel Castro is going to be overthrown. Well, Arthur Schlesinger was called in to give his advice on this plan in late March of 1961, and Schlesinger stressed that the United States is going to be blamed for this invasion of Cuba. Any invasion of Cuba is going to be the case of the United States is 100% behind it. Allen Dulles is like, no, it's not going to be the situation. We'll be completely disengaged from it. We can easily walk away from it. William Fulbright and Chester Bowles, who were also brought in for their advice. Fulbright stressed that this is using, in essence, a water cannon to put out a match. Castro is a thorn in the flesh. He's not a dagger to the heart. Dean Acheson, who had been Harry Truman's former Secretary of State, stated to John Kennedy when Kennedy told him the plans, he said, "Are you serious? 1,500 Cubans are not as good as 25,000 Cubans that these 1,500 Cubans are going to be facing." Nevertheless, the Kennedy administration went ahead with what becomes known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, April 15, 1961. Well, it wasn't even here 1,500. It was only 1,400 rebels would be landing here on the morning of April 15th. And immediately, Castro sends out his forces to attack. The forces on the ground, these anti-Castro Cuban exiles, are either killed, they surrender, the whole thing's over in a matter of a few hours. The Bay of Pigs invasion is a complete and total fiasco. It is a complete and total fiasco. John Kennedy, however, is going to do the right thing. The blame really rested with Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. This was all his idea. John Kennedy said privately after the Bay of Pigs invasion, just 2 months now after he has taken office, "How could I have been so stupid?" But he goes across the airwaves here on the evening of April 15th, and he accepts 100% of the blame, showing superb leadership, quite frankly. Actually, because of this, his popularity with the American public increases even more so. John Kennedy, within a week, would see to it that Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, would be formally forced into an early retirement. And this happens with the Soviet Union. As far as the Soviets are concerned, that the Americans are going to be overthrowing here Fidel Castro, or at least attempting to. They become very, very concerned, very much alarmed. And Nikita Khrushchev, here as 1961 continues, is planning to meet with John Kennedy. This young upstart, he's only 43 years of age now, by this time he'd be 44. And yes, he was a World War II veteran, but he fought in the Pacific Theater, and he's no Eisenhower. He's nothing like General Eisenhower, who Khrushchev did respect up until the time of the U-2 incident. And what Khrushchev is planning, as these two are going to meet in Vienna in 1961, is he's planning to attempt to bully John Kennedy, to berate him, to get the upper hand for the Soviets because of this failed invasion of Cuba, because of this complete fiasco. What will happen here as 1961 progresses is this increase of tension, unlike never before, between the United States and the Soviet Union. To the stage that back in the Kremlin in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev begins considering ways of keeping the United States at bay, to keep here the United States from ever invading or attempting to invade Cuba ever again. And he's going to do this by starting to build secretly ICBM nuclear missile silos, as you can see on our map behind me, on Cuban soil. What all of this is going to mean here in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is ultimately this is going to lead these two nations to the brink of nuclear war. What was viewed here back in 1962 of these two nations becoming very, very close to nuclear war, recent scholarship coming both from the US government, but especially here from Russian archives, Soviet archives, showed that the two nations came unbelievably close to the unthinkable in 1962. And what unfolds and what all of this ultimately means, we'll see in our final presentation tomorrow. Thank you so very much. Thank you.